Welcome to our Planning for Uncertainty webinar. Thank you all for being here. My name is Andy Danilchek. I'm the director of the Project for Mental Health and Optimal Development, which was started in 2018. I want to introduce my partner, in fact, co-founder and faculty director of the project, Michael Nakkula. Mike, you want to tell us what our project does?
Thanks, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here and welcome everybody. Our project, the Project for Mental Health and Optimal Development, was designed to explore relationships that support children and youth, relationships that involve teachers, educators of other types, including mentors and parents. So as Andy said, we were founded in 2018 and have been working hard to do this work since then.
And out of our work with the project, we developed a newly published resource called the Planning for Uncertainty, an Educator's Guide to Navigating the COVID-19 Era, which we're going to share about more during our presentation. For now, we're going to put the link you should see it in chat to the guide itself. Okay. Now let's do a couple of housekeeping things. We will share the link to the guide again at the end of the presentation, and we'll also send out the PDF. We've disabled the public chat, but the moderator will use the chat to share other relevant links as well. So things will pop up in chat as we go. To be the most present, we really encourage you to maximize your Zoom screen. It's your choice, but we want you to have a flow experience. Mike and I talk about flow a lot. We study it. We think it's great to be in that zone, and hopefully we can have one of those experiences today. But you decide what you need to do for yourself. You can also use the Q&A function for any question, which will be addressed towards the end. So you can submit your questions through that. And we're really glad that we're here. And with that, let's dig in. So this is really a great time of uncertainty. It's been, for 8 months, we've been living in this kind of bizarro, surreal, suspended reality. Not really sure how and when we can see family, going to our jobs. We've canceled plans. Big life events have been put off or changed. And we're not really sure when we could start planning again. Mike, you want to continue?
Yeah, Andy, we really think about this period as an age of uncertainty. Certainly in most of our lifetimes, if not all of our lifetimes, things have not been this uncertain. So we're seeing it with teachers in their classrooms and students not being sure how they're going to respond to the particular challenges of their different courses. And it leaves us all in a precarious situation. So, we know the COVID-19 era brings its own challenges. And on top of that, we have an election that's extremely contentious, to put it mildly. We have the racial justice issues and police brutality issues that have been on our television screens regularly. So there's just so much going on all at once that this age is a peculiar one, and it really calls for the kind of work that we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, Mike. We'd like to get a sense of who the audience is. So you should see on the screen a little thing pop up. So go to menti.com and enter. We have 2 questions we'd like you to answer. So if you go to menti.com and type in the code you see on the screen, 694076-6, or you could click on the link that's in chat. That link should be there and should be able to get you there. Okay, so our first question, and we'll give a little time for, we're starting to get some answers here. That's great. The first question, how is your school currently conducting learning? I know in PA, we have a bunch of schools starting to go hybrid. It's interesting. We see 0% in-person learning. Probably reflects that we're at the highest numbers we've been at since this thing has started. A lot of folks doing virtual learning. Wow, 70% virtual learning, 29% hybrid learning. And we know hybrid has its own challenges, which we'll talk about a little bit today. Okay, let's go on to our second question. It's in 0% in-person learning. So the second question, in one word or phrase, what is causing you or your school the most uncertainty right now? Seems like uncertainty is the word of the times for us. So we'd like to see reopening, money. We may see some words that overlap. Fear. All right, now it's starting to look a little bit interesting. Frustration, constant change, internet issues, stress, COVID disease, going back. Oh, wow. So this really gives us a sense of the range of things causing uncertainty. It really is significant how many things are doing that. And I'm honestly a little distracted at how the words are dancing around and getting smaller and smaller, but there's so many things in play. All right, let's go forward now. This gives a good sense of where we are. So there are so many uncertainties and unknowns that it really is helpful for us to reframe some of our thinking and help educators get unstuck. And what we've come up with out of this is something we call an uncertainty mindset. So an uncertainty mindset, I'll just read the definition. It's a disposition that encourages embracing the unknown to remain responsive to needs and opportunities as they emerge. It's really about embracing what you can control, not really obsessing about what you can't. I mean, we really have to embrace that and deal with the fact that mental health is a really big concern right now, and the challenges that we are facing. That a lot of them are out of our control, and that's frustrating. But we know we cannot teach, and our students cannot learn if we ignore wellness needs and mental health. So we hope we know the uncertainty mindset approach, it's rooted in this understanding that ensuring the mental health of students and educators, it must be a critical part of any action planning that we do. So when we apply the uncertainty mindset, there are three key areas. You can see that on the graphic on the slide: dialogue, climate, and equity. And the mindset also encourages commitment to ongoing reflection and evaluation. And you see that on the periphery of our circle. Through this approach, educators, we can develop and leverage relationships with students and other stakeholders so we can make better decisions about students' needs and their own wellness. Okay, we know that many of our students are struggling. There's less opportunities for socialization, there's loss of learning time, there's regression in learning and abilities, especially at the elementary level, possible family instability and tension. You know, one of the biggest questions this leads us to ask, and we've been asking this since the pandemic started, is how do we help students develop optimally in suboptimal conditions? How can we make the best of what we're dealing with and move towards thriving? When we're just trying to get by in like the here and now, how do we begin to think about longer term well-being and thriving? Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
Yep, tell us about optimal development.
Yeah, I think you set it up extremely well with the question, how do we develop optimally in suboptimal conditions? So when we talk about optimal development, we move away a little bit from the classic definition, which really looks at peak performance, how people can develop their optimal capacities to perform in an area like music or athletics or academics. But optimal development, as we see it and as we approach it within our project, is defined as the best performance that is realistic for people within their current conditions. So for students in schools at this time, their optimal development might look different than it would in other times because the supports aren't there. So we encourage educators and students to work together with families to define formally or informally what optimal development looks like for our students during this period.
So the best way for us to really share this framework with you is through applying it to what's really happening in schools. So we're about to show you a real life case study from a school counselor in Philadelphia, which we slightly adapted from the circumstances of last spring. After seeing this case, our panel of educators will walk through how they would apply the uncertainty mindset framework to the challenges at hand.
Meet Marcus. Marcus is a Black student in a public school in a large city. He is socially popular, but his teachers have often considered him a problem student. At age 10, he was diagnosed with ADHD and ODD. He now has a mobile therapist. Last year, Marcus's behavior began to improve when he joined the basketball team. His coaches motivated him and helped him imagine a successful future. In English class, he began writing about being a young Black male in America. He forged a connection with his teacher, Mr. Adams, which led to improved engagement even after basketball season. This past summer, Marcus's grandmother died after contracting COVID-19. Marcus has been grieving this loss deeply. Now that he is back at school, Mr. Adams has noticed a regression in his behavior and changes in mood. Hybrid learning is making it difficult for Marcus to complete his work, and he is extremely disappointed basketball has been canceled. At home, Marcus's parents are consumed by their own work and cannot assist him during the day, and they cannot afford to hire a tutor. At school, he often sleeps in class, but when awake, he has been disruptive. Frustrated, Mr. Adams often sends Marcus to the school resource officer, something that has been frequent for Marcus and makes him resentful of school. How can we use the uncertainty mindset to support Marcus? Meet Marcus.
Okay, we've already met Marcus. That was great. And thank you for fixing it so we can hear Marcus in this case as well. Right now, I'm going to introduce our educated panel. And I just want to say about the framework that we really developed it to approach the complex challenges of the time. And we think that we have 6 scenarios in our guide, and we think that if you go through that, like the way that these educators will take you through a little bit, you start to develop the mindset, and it helps you adapt to and the action plan that we created about for Marcus. So Deb Broderick is a project guide leader for this team and was a primary writer of our guide. She's and is now the instructor and coordinator of the Teacher Academy program at Central Monco Technical High School in Plymouth Meeting, PA. She has a doctorate in education from the University of Pennsylvania. Matthew Kay was a founding teacher at Philadelphia's Science Leadership Academy and has been teaching English there for nearly 15 years. He's the author of Not Light But Fire, How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom, an incredibly valuable and practical guide for teachers. He holds a master's in educational leadership with the principal cert from the California University of Pennsylvania and guidance department chair at Penwood Middle School in Darby, PA. She's been a counselor for about 15 years and also works as a mobile therapist and behavioral specialist. She has many masters, including masters in community counseling, masters in educational counseling, and masters in educational leadership, all from Wilmington University. These 3 are awesome educators, and we're happy to have them here for our panel. Deb, over to you to start walking us through Marcus's case.
Thanks, Andy. I want to start by acknowledging that there's a lot going on for Marcus, as there is for all of our students, and honestly, for all of us as educators too. That's the part that can feel so paralyzing. Where do we even begin to try to unpack all of the issues our students are facing right now? We're hoping that the uncertainty mindset framework will be that place to start for you. We recommend first by trying to flesh out all the different issues at play. For Marcus, this includes the complicated grief of not only losing his grandmother, but also losing what he considers normal life, filled with athletics, basketball, school, friends. Marcus also has some unmet academic needs and lacks some supports that other students around him are getting through private tutors and pods. His parents are both working from home, and they can't really stop work to help him with schoolwork, so he's feeling isolated. He also has some behavioral issues, which are most likely a combination of being misunderstood, mixed with his own real struggles in this area. And due to the hybrid learning environment, he has a shrinking support network. So this is really a lot on Marcus's plate, and a lot on his teacher's plate as well, as he tries to figure out what the best strategy and action plan is going forward. So we suggest that you select the most pressing issue or issues to analyze and address first, a kind of triaging of issues so that you can then loop back as needed. Of course, we understand that these issues are intertwined. His behavioral issues, for example, might be driven in part by his academic needs, for instance, and that interventions for one thing will undoubtedly impact other elements. But by narrowing your and your team's focus, you can move away from that unstuck feeling towards action planning. The goal here is to recognize and remove barriers and put supports in place for Marcus's success. Now on to the framework. As Andy noted, there are 3 core components: dialogue, climate, and equity. You can start from any one of these lenses, and we have a few guiding questions that can help you first unpack what is happening and then create action steps rooted in mental wellness. All this focuses on translating an overwhelming set of circumstances into things that are within your control. Tamika will get us started with talking about essential dialogues that need to happen to support Marcus. Then I will walk us through climate, and Matt will round things off with a discussion of equity issues.
Deb mentioned previously, I've been asked to talk to you today regarding the importance of ongoing dialogue with our stakeholders. Due to the COVID crisis, many of our schools have been coming up with creative ways to keep our students connected while learning online and even in our socially distanced classrooms. As educators, we must recognize that the work that we do this school year will look vastly different, especially since most of our interaction with our students, their families, and our colleagues have only existed in a virtual world. In general, but most certainly during these challenging times, it is so important to not engage in this work alone. We need to expand our network of support, our students' network of support, and work together to come up with successful and helpful interventions. During this time, we also must learn to be flexible, as many situations will arise that are not within our control. When applying Marcus's scenario to the framework, educators can really start at any point, but I believe that it should begin with dialogue, because centering Marcus and his network of support are central to the challenges we saw outlined in the scenario. In Marcus's case, his unique success will have to begin by understanding how he defines success himself. Add to that his strengths and the level of support that he received from those he had trusted relationships with. As Marcus's school counselor, my first priority would be to address the grief that he has experienced due to the passing of his grandmother. Her death appears to have triggered a significant decline in his behavior and academic performance. Getting a clear picture of Marcus's story and the people who played a role in his life prior to his grandmom's passing is key to developing a successful plan of action to get Marcus back on track. The first step of the plan would be to reestablish Marcus's connections with his stakeholders, keeping in mind that each person plays a significant and unique role in Marcus's life. In any helping situation, it is important for the individual to maintain a strong voice. It is also important for Marcus to remain an active participant and his action planning and who he determines as people who he trusts the most. So, as Marcus's counselor and with Marcus's input, together, we would identify people who are invested in Marcus's success. So in the case of Marcus, some of his relevant stakeholders would be Marcus himself, his parents, his basketball coach, his teacher, specifically Mr. Adams, his English teacher, me, his guidance counselor, his mobile therapist and behavior specialist, and last but not least, the school resource officer. There could also be a list of other identified stakeholders, depending on who Marcus feels closest to in the school community. Now that we've talked about the importance of ongoing collaboration and dialogue with stakeholders, it is important to ask yourself, what can I do as a stakeholder to support Marcus and other students like him? As a school counselor, I would suggest that you first reach out to the family to schedule a meeting. The meeting should include Marcus, any family members in his household, as well as his current treatment team. During this meeting, you will want to talk about the successes and the strengths of the family, as well as looking at areas that they would like to improve. During this meeting, you may also want to look at some resources for Marcus, such as an additional family member who lives outside of the home, maybe a next door neighbor who Marcus can hang out with on the separate porches. In doing so, Marcus actually may have an opportunity to socialize with someone as well as maintain social distance. We also may want to look at some possible clubs that are currently meeting virtually. This way, Marcus has an opportunity to make a choice. The goal is not to overwhelm him, but provide him with multiple outlets to choose from. During this meeting, I also hope to gain some strategies that I can take back to Marcus's teachers that can be implemented in their classrooms, whether it be virtually or in person. I'm hoping that from this meeting, I will gain a better understanding of Marcus, his family, and their needs, because I feel like this would better prepare me to be able to support Marcus, his family, and his teachers. After my meeting with Marcus's family and treatment team, I would then meet with his teachers to kind of go over some of the strategies that were given to me during my meeting with his treatment team and family. It is my hope that during this meeting, we will also get an update on Marcus's progress, with the hopes that he has had an opportunity to meet at some level of success. It also will be a great opportunity for teachers to share some of their own strategies with their fellow colleagues. It also may be a good opportunity for them to identify some areas from which we can all praise Marcus. As most educators know, it is important to develop good and healthy relationships with our students. So as Marcus's guidance counselor, I think it would be important for me to arrange a time during the day for Marcus to check in with a trusted adult. This time could be used as an opportunity for mentorship, for him to reconnect with either the basketball coach or Mr. Adams. Something as simple as, hey Marcus, come check in with me for virtual office hours would suffice. I would also suggest that the school resource officer check in on Marcus so that their interaction isn't always occurring when he's being reprimanded. I would also suggest that the teacher share with the school resource officer some of Marcus's success so that the school resource officer can share in the praise. Finally, I think that my role as a guidance counselor is to advocate for students such as Marcus. My goal is always to make sure that I build better supports for my students. In doing so, I also work hard to empower and build capacity within my fellow colleagues so that they are better prepared to support our children. Because in reality, teachers are our first line of support because they are the ones that see our students every day. And now Deb will talk to you guys more about climate.
Thanks, Tamika, for sharing the dialogue component of the framework. As you note, it's critical to make sure that as we aim to support our students, we must include stakeholders that often get overlooked and include them in conversations around action planning. It does indeed take a village to support our students. So building on Tamika's discussion, I'll be walking us through the climate component. Our team sees climate as a critical area to unpack, and we examine it at 3 distinct levels: the classroom, school-wide, and the larger society outside of school. It's through an intentional analysis of climate across settings that we can adapt and restructure our spaces to be more responsive to our students and ourselves. In the next slide, I'll walk us through a response to the critical questions we should ask ourselves when unpacking issues of climate. We first think about how to make classrooms safe and supportive for students. And it's also really important to think about, what does a safe space look for my students? One student's safe space is not another student's safe space. How also does the larger school climate, including school-wide policies and practices, impact the situation at hand? And finally, how have larger societal issues, including the COVID-19 crisis, affected the situation? These are all really important questions to dig into, and that's what we're going to do for Marcus here. So in this scenario, Marcus is widely perceived by teachers as a quote-unquote problem student who's been identified as having both ADHD and ODD. But what if the root of the problem isn't actually Marcus? What happens when we shift our attention to the institutional norms and examine the school-wide policies and practices that view Marcus through a pathologizing lens? And what I mean by that is that we diagnose Marcus as opposed to aiming to understand contextual factors that may contribute to his temperament and behavior. It's really important to think about the ways we talk about students, and that in pathologizing their behavior, we can actually create situations where blame falls solely on the student, and it therefore frees us from examining the systems in place that contribute to in damaging ways to Marcus's path in school. For Marcus, this has meant that he's been routinely sent to the school resource officer, an armed law enforcement officer, to address his behavioral issues. This has not only left Marcus resentful, but it also criminalizes this young middle school boy at a crucial time in his development. This happens at the classroom, school, and societal levels, as we've witnessed this summer with the racial, social justice movements taking hold across the country. As Marcus begins to grapple with the complexities of what it means to be Black in America, he is simultaneously making sense of his world through the lens of his school experiences. It's critical that we acknowledge Marcus's experience, but we also must question the problematic policies and practices of our institutions. For Marcus, the intersection of the racial social justice movement with the pandemic has proven far too overwhelming for him. Marcus has suffered a tremendous loss in losing his grandmother to COVID. It's especially important for us to support students like Marcus through their grief and understand that some of what we're calling problem behaviors could in fact be viewed as a normal grief response. Each of us deals with grief in our own ways, and this is true for Marcus as well as all of our students who have been impacted by COVID. There's a real collective sense of grief in the country right now, and with Marcus's immediate and personal loss, it's really important for us to be mindful about how he responds to this trauma. So the big question is, how do we change the conversation around Marcus from one that is pathologizing to one that exhibits empathy and respect for the enormity of Marcus's situation? And the question that is perhaps most relevant to me as a teacher is, how can I make my classroom a safe and supportive space for my students? And how do those school-wide policies impact the space that I can create in my classroom? there is still a lot we can do in terms of our responsiveness in our own classroom, despite the fact that we might be informed by and held accountable to school-wide policies and practices. In the case of Marcus, if I were a colleague of his teacher, Mr. Adams, I would recommend that he examine his own classroom policies and practices and determine if there are certain ways that these practices either help or hinder Marcus in his progress. For example, rather than sending Marcus to the school resource officer every time Marcus has an issue, Mr. Adams actually could collaborate with the school counselor to develop a set of cool-down practices that Marcus can employ when he gets upset. Marcus could also collaborate with the school counselor on ways that he can better respond when he's upset. Additionally, Mr. Adams could build in time for the whole class to practice trauma-informed mindfulness activities. This would help students identify where they are physically and emotionally, and in this way, Marcus could build some concrete skills that will help him better articulate his feelings. Mr. Adams could also rethink his curriculum to be more responsive to not just Marcus, but to all of his students who are experiencing the collective trauma of this moment. This could include things like diversifying the materials and content of his class to include contemporary authors of color, as well as rethinking the type of work he assigns. For example, incorporating creative work, which allows students to individualize their responses, is a great way for students to process the world around them. With students being able to individualize their work when there's no right or wrong answer, students feel a lot more agency about the work that they're doing in school. I do this in my own classes through integrating art into the curriculum. For Marcus, who likes to write, creative journaling assignments could give him such an outlet to work through some of what he's experiencing. And finally, it's important that Mr. Adams work toward changing the one-dimensional narrative around Marcus, from one where he's characterized as the problem student to one where he's acknowledged as a full human being who is responding to a complex world. Changing the conversation requires us as educators to not only look inward, to understand how our own identity impacts our students' experiences, but it also requires us to examine the issues of equity and access, which my colleague Matt will walk us through in the next section of the Uncertainty Mindset Framework. Matt, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. Another lens that we should apply to situations like Marcus's is the equity lens. It's easy sometimes for us teachers of goodwill to avoid honestly engaging this particular lens. We might be tempted to say, I don't need this. I like everybody. I don't ever try to hurt my students. I'm not racist. I'm not sexist. I'm not homophobic. I'm not whatever. But this lens does ask us to look more deeply at our and our students' positioning in the world. And it pushes us to consider how these identities influence our perspectives, actions, and access to opportunities. This examination can really help us to better understand situations like Marcus's. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. The first one is, how does my social cultural identity influence how I'm viewing and responding to this situation? It's an important first step to think about who you are in the world and how various privileges and struggles might be impacting the way that we view a student's situation. So let's look at privileges first. If Marcus was my student, one of the first things I would notice is his perceived defiance towards myself or my colleagues. So for me, I've taught in a no excuses charter school before moving to a high performing magnet with very egalitarian attitudes about a teacher's place in the classroom. The first place conditioned me to think of the classroom as a place where teachers may freely wield autocratic power over their students. And in the latter, where I am now, teachers are encouraged to seek consensus when possible and to de-emphasize harsh language and power plays with their students. In the first situation, I had the privilege of knowing that my administration and the greater school community not only supported, but openly praised and rewarded my way or the highway tactics meant to force deference in my students. And in the second, I had the privilege of counting on the school's implicit understanding of the teacher's moral authority. Said simply, in the first environment, I could shout Marcus down or send him to the resource officer when I experienced his quote unquote disrespect. In the second, I didn't have to because it was a magnet school, which weeded out students with failing test scores and behavior problems. This reflection on my privileges at the very least should humble me in my interactions with Marcus. It should show me how my existing attitudes have been shaped by the power dynamics in my previous buildings. If Marcus is being taught by a white colleague, they should also take into account how they might be interpreting Marcus's behavior as even more intense than it is. This could be due to stereotyping of Black males or to comparing the stereotypically conscientious behavior of suburban, private school, or magnet school white kids to that of at-risk Black students. In this case, they need to talk to a colleague or a counselor or other stakeholders to make sure that they are evaluating Marcus's behavior accurately. Interestingly, I can also analyze personally how my lack of privileges might be impacting my view on Marcus. For instance, I misbehaved a lot in middle school, and I did not get diagnosed with ADHD or ODD. I did not have a behavior therapist or a mobile therapist. Therefore, I might find myself skeptical of their value. I might be slower to pay attention to the advice that those professionals offer, or I might even find myself undermining what they say to Marcus or his parents. I might instead be tempted to push grit ideology on the situation, which could undersell just how serious Marcus's difficulties might be. I might allow myself to grieve. Once I realize this, I need to allow myself to grieve my own past, how I may have been treated as a student, and not use my experiences to belittle supports that Marcus deserves. I must do whatever I can to be an enthusiastic member of his support team, modeling trust in the more trauma-informed, empathetic approaches that his team advises. The second question is, how does Marcus's sociocultural identity influence how he's viewing and responding to the situation? There's every reason to think that Marcus might have internalized the bad boy labels that have been applied to his behavior since he was 10. Every new class he's gone to, his teacher has known who he was before he got there and has had conversations about how to best handle him. He is yet to get the opportunity to meet a teacher and probably any classmates with something that's like a blank slate. So when he acts up, when he gets in trouble, people are not surprised. They likely appear to him to be more validated than disappointed. Like, well, I knew he was going to act like that, so there he is acting like that. It's very possible that many of the same outbursts that got him negative attention from teachers might also trigger laughs and other patronizing and authentic affirmations from his classmates, like, not laughing with you, but laughing at you and stuff like that. But in his case, both basketball and writing provide opportunities for him to redefine himself, both with his coaches and mentors who existed outside of his classroom reputation, and from his teammates and writing buddies and classmates who had a radically different relationship with him. So both new communities, however, are gone because of COVID and the hybrid model. So my first thought is, how can we provide structured at-home activities that might mimic the now familiar structures that worked for him in the athletic and or writing spaces that he loved? And secondly, how can we create new spaces that allow him to own his new, fresh, non-pathologized identity? This reflection can be super hard work. This reflection takes time. This reflection requires you to talk to other people and to really be honest with yourself. And it's important that sometimes we remember and we feel comfortable advocating for time to reflect, because this reflection can help us in our interactions with students a great deal.
My final thoughts on the Marcus scenario is that for Marcus is very familiar to me. Marcus, his family, his treatment team, these are all the different people that I have had the privilege during my time as a school counselor to work with and to learn from. What I have learned is that each and every one of these students have a unique story. And I've also learned that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to helping. What we have discovered are that there are numerous boundaries and barriers that exist that can make helping students even more difficult. Now add to that a pandemic, where our in-person connection to our students are limited. This means that as educators, we have to work even harder to connect with our students. And for some students, their educator, whether it be their teacher, their coach, the school counselor, the security officer, we may be all this one student looks forward to each day when they arrive at school.
As I reflect on the experiences of working through the uncertainty framework with my colleagues, Tamika and Matt, I'm really struck by the value of collaboration, and that through Tamika and Matt's insights, I've been able to understand Marcus's experiences in ways not possible if I had done this in isolation. This is perhaps one of my biggest takeaways, that educators should not do this work alone, that it's important to have many voices in the room, including key stakeholders like Marcus and his family, in addition to trusted colleagues. As Tamika pointed out, it's critical to center Marcus's voice in these conversations and have him work alongside his team to co-construct his learning plan and identify his future goals. Another important takeaway comes from Matt's equity section, that as a white educator, it's critical to examine my own sociocultural identity and consider the ways that my identity informs my interactions with students. And finally, I will continue to work with my colleagues to identify, question, and examine problematic practices and policies at the classroom and institutional levels.
I want to thank the panelists for doing a wonderful job unpacking the Marcus scenario. I want to talk a little bit about the goals of the uncertainty mindset. I want to do this kind of quickly so we could get to the Q&A, which we're really excited about. You know, through the discussion of this case, we saw how the uncertainty mindset helped Deb, Tamika, and Matt make sense of uncertainty by focusing on what we can control. And we really do think that the guide can help us navigate this new mental health landscape that we have, not just the mental health landscape, but how to engage students academically, how to manage the kinds of things that come up. So the framework is more comprehensively discussed or presented in our guide, which I'd like to highlight a little bit now. So if we go to the guide highlights, the heart of the guide are the scenarios. We have 6 scenarios and action plans that go along with it, like Marcus's. It emphasizes that this is something that can really help you dig into complex situations like we're dealing with every day. We had a bunch of people over the summer, teachers, counselors, school leaders, other school personnel, share their cases and information, and we adapted these into our scenarios. So we hope they have a ring of authenticity given what they came from. Now, the action plan also includes some suggested tools and resources that would help in addressing each case. So we have a bunch of tools focused on student and educator mental wellness, relationship building, and other things. There are surveys, checklists, and activity suggestions. We also have a resource list that was really carefully cultivated, led by Deb, that has lists of books, websites, things that can support us with areas of mindfulness, trauma-informed practices, teaching about COVID-19, and engaging with families. We did all of this with the goal of providing educator with tools that you can practically implement that can really help you in the classroom. So here's, we see a sample set of one of the guide's tools. It might be a little hard to see the print, but it focuses on student experiences in the virtual classroom. The guide has student, educator, and family versions of this survey. For each case study in the guide, we also note specific resources that can help as well. And you can see the link in the chat for that. We'll share this guide link again. I want to note the project was funded by the Harold W. McGraw Jr. Family Foundation, without which we wouldn't have been able to spend the time to put together something so comprehensive and offer it to the country for free, to the world. So this brings us to our Q&A, which we are really excited about because we want to hear about your questions and respond to that in this Q&A. We have Deb Broderick, who's staying on, and we should note that she's currently teaching in a hybrid model and brings great perspective on the ground. She's joined by Mike Nakkula, who you met earlier, and he is, in addition to being the co-founder and faculty director of our Project for Mental Health and Development, he's also a professor of practice at Penn GSE and chair of the Human Development and Quantitative Methods Division. He's a development expert, and he has a doctorate in counseling and consulting psychology from Harvard, where he was also a faculty member. So Mike, Deb, welcome.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. So we have, it looks like we have one question that just popped up in the Q&A that I can answer quickly, Mike. It's
okay. Are
the scenario videos available to use with my student teachers? Are there videos for each? So right now we have Marcus is the only animation that we have completed so far. As you can imagine, we were under a really tight turnaround for this project. We started in July. And so our plan is to have animations for all of the scenarios. There are 6 in the guide. So there's 5 more in addition to Marcus. And so the goal is that, and what we hope for is to really have those animations ready to go. And we would love for you to be able to use those with student teachers. We have a website, and on our website, we will have resources available so that you can just go directly there and download things for your use, including PDFs of some of the resources and tools that we have too. Okay, so there's another question, Mike. This one's for you, Mike, okay?
Okay.
I've always felt like I was able to connect to my students in class, but now that we're virtual, I'm struggling to make meaningful connections with my students. What can I do to build relationships in an online format?
Great question. And that's one we hear coming up again and again from educators. Many educators, as we know, have really built their pedagogy around building a sense of connectedness, really learning something specific about each of their students and using that as a hook to engage the students in their classrooms. So one of the things that we think has been a particular challenge in the virtual arena is that we're not practiced in it. It's not that we can't make connections with students as we, gain more confidence with the technology. It's that we haven't had enough practice with it over time. So we've been hearing this from teachers who've been, working with Zoom and other technologies for a little longer, coming up with strategies that allow them to connect with students in different ways than they did in the past. So for example, connecting students in small work groups, teachers facilitating small work groups with students in breakout sessions on Zoom, maybe around a common challenge that the students are interested in, can be helpful. In fact, we've been underscoring the importance of teachers helping students to engage each other, as opposed to thinking it has to be a one-on-one engagement effort with 30 or however many students a teacher might have. So that's one thing that comes to mind most immediately, Deb.
So the next question is actually related to what you were just talking about, Matt. It's also, or Mike, I'm not sure why I just called you Matt. Anyway, Mike. So the question is, any suggestions for those of us teaching hybrid right now? It feels like I'm doing 2 separate jobs and it's impossible to do both well. And I think that relates to what you were just talking about, the struggle to have meaningful connections with students in this environment. I am teaching hybrid right now, and I often do feel like I'm doing 2 separate jobs. But I think that one of the ways that I'm trying to approach this is I have students who are, I'm fortunate enough to have video conferencing capability in my class. And so I have some kids on that video conference and some in the room. And one of the things that I started to do in order to for me to connect with my students, but my hybrid students to connect to my virtual students, is to, when we're doing group work in the class and I'm able to, with social distance, have kids work together, I'll have somebody from the hybrid setting, the in-person setting, work with the person in the virtual setting. So they will come up and join them on the video conference, and the students in the virtual space will feel much more connected to the classroom and what's happening on the ground. And so that's one of the things that I've been doing. But I can relate to this idea of the difficulty of that. The next question is for you, Mike, but I might be able to respond to this too. I'm struggling just to get through the day. How do I prioritize self-care when I don't feel like I have enough time to even complete my work?
Mm-hmm. You want to take on part of that, Deb, first?
Sure. Yeah, I can take on it, sort of from that teacher perspective, and then you could give us your insight from the project perspective, the optimal development perspective. I think self-care is really difficult right now. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that, especially in the hybrid environment, I do feel like I'm working two jobs. So I never feel like I'm able to get the list of things that I have to get done for the day. It never really gets completed. And so one of the things that I've had to do is reframe my thinking around what does a successful day look like, and how can I let that go, let that list go, and really kind of prioritize the things that must happen, and then the things that I can, my day looks different than it did pre-pandemic. And so in order to really get through, I have to prioritize some self-care things like going for a walk or exercising or doing some meditation in order to continue to be successful, and not kind of beat myself up for all the things that I'm not finishing each day.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I'm facing right now.
So that's a great segue, Deb, because one of the ways I think about self-care is that the opposite of it might be self-punishment. And we can really be punitive on ourselves for not getting the job done in the way we want to. If we're not meeting the demands of the virtual classroom and the hybrid classroom well enough, and maybe feel a little unprepared for it, we can become extraordinarily hard on ourselves. So in relation to that, people are even hard on themselves for not doing their self-care well. I haven't been caring enough, and then another level of punishment comes in. So I try to make sure we think about self-care not in either or terms, all or nothing at all terms, but little moments, small moments of self-care, a relaxing walk, a conversation with a friend. It doesn't have to be that you hit the weight room for the full workout session, or you did a meditation just right this time. In fact, the meditation specialist helped me with this myself. She said, if you can do 3 minutes of meditation, remember there's no bad meditation. Just allow yourself to breathe and take the time you have. If that freed me up to practice a little bit, as opposed to thinking I had to do my self-care properly.
I love that. I do think that a really quick meditation is really helpful. One of the things that we've been doing in my class with the hybrid environment is, and I know that other schools are doing this, students are only coming for one day or they're coming twice a week or something like that. And so I'm trying to do some of that self-care with my students in the classroom through innovative brain breaks that I'm having the students run. So for example, tomorrow, one of my students is doing chair yoga sessions so that the students are also getting that kind of self-care as well. There is another question. Often the students who feel most disconnected are the ones who refuse to turn their camera on. With a room full of black boxes, how can we build a positive online learning community? I could maybe take that one first, because that's something that I'm facing currently, as in today, this happened to me. This is a real issue. And I think that sometimes I think this is where the uncertainty framework can really help us think through an equity lens on reasons why students might want to keep their camera off. We have to be really mindful about students' home life situations and where they are situated in the virtual environment. Some of my students are literally in the middle of their family's living room, and with other people running through and things going on at home that they don't really want to turn their camera on. Initially, I had tried to enforce, you must turn your camera on. But as I started to kind of really think through an equity lens, I kind of scaled back on that thought, and really have tried to be mindful of not only the equity issues at play, but also the real Zoom fatigue, right? Like the idea of constantly looking at yourself while you're in class, which is not something students have had to do before. They don't stare at themselves while they're in class, generally speaking. And so this has a level of fatigue that can happen. And so what can you actually do? Because I agree with whoever asked this question. You do start to feel disconnected. The student feels disconnected from the class if they don't have their camera on, and the teacher feels disconnected from the student. And so some of the ways that I've tried to resolve this, not resolve it, but address it while still kind of having the equity lens, is to require them to have their cameras on during certain moments in class. So if we're doing something where students are giving each other feedback, for example, I might ask them to all turn their screens on and unmute themselves. And I've had like an explicit conversation about, why we might need to turn our screens off at times, and have them really understand that they're not necessarily getting in trouble or because they don't have their screen on, but allowing them that option, that agency of how they're going to participate in class. Another colleague of mine, she has a large class and she has most of the kids have their screens off. So what she did was she coordinated personal conferences where she met with students one-on-one with the camera on so that she could directly connect with the student. And she noticed that once she had met with all of her students in this manner in a small conference, that they started to turn their camera on a little bit more. They felt a little bit more connected. So I think that there are several things you can do to address that, but I don't know if you have any insights on that too, Mike.
Yeah, I'm actually going to jump in, and we're going to have to knock your Mike's insights as much as they're amazing, but for time. Okay, and I wanted to just point out in one of the Q&As, Jody DaCosta recommended Headspace as a free meditation app.
Right.
It's at least it's free in Delaware, so check it out. Anyway, thank you so much, Mike and Deb, for the Q&A. And I thank the participants for really great, thoughtful questions. Before we say good night, I have a number of links to share with you. We want you to, the link for the guide is in chat. We want you to share it, use it, and download it and enjoy it. Anyone interested in setting up a PD session or consultation for your school staff or educator group, you can contact us through the website. Their email is there. These sessions are free. They're funded by the McGraw Grant. We'll also soon be debuting a podcast series, The Uncertain Educator, that draws on this work and responds to like the challenges that we face this year. A link to subscribe to this soon to be coming chat soon to be coming podcast is in the chat. So we're also looking to continue improving upon this work. And we'd love your feedback on today's session. Take a few minutes and now to complete a brief survey of the webinar. This is also a space to sign up to become involved with our project, including as a guest on our podcast. We're really looking for educators on the ground and experts that can come in and engage in great conversation. So the link is in chat for the survey. Before we conclude, I would like to acknowledge the incredible team that put all this together. As I mentioned earlier, we have a team of teachers, counselors, school leaders, and university faculty and staff who collaborated to create and refine the uncertainty mindset framework itself, and to write our student and educator cases and develop our suite of tools. I want to highlight that this ongoing work is being developed by the Project for Mental Health and Optimal Development at Penn GSE in partnership with GSE's Office of School and Community Engagement. And again, we are so grateful to the Harold W. McGraw Jr. Family Foundation, a non-for-profit private foundation focused on supporting education, youth services, community health, and medical research. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great night.